We have a small group today, so feel free to chime in if you have questions as we move along. So by way of background, I am Karen Weber. I have been the forensic accountant, and my firm, Weber CPA, has been the forensic accountant for the New York State E-MDT teams since those started formally in the upstate region around 2012. So we've done this for about 10 years, and as all of you go out and try to find your forensic accountants and work with them on your existing teams, we're here to answer any questions you have. No question is too dumb. I'm going to talk today about a number of things. What a forensic accountant is, if you haven't worked with one already, how you locate one in your area, what role they're going to serve on your team, the various types of responsibilities that they can have. You may choose to limit it, you may choose to expand it, but I'll talk really to our experience in New York State. Critical to the forensic accounting component is the case referral process, because we want to make sure we marshal our dollars appropriately. And then what sort of deliverables you can expect from the forensic accountants that you work with. On the admin side, I know that there are a lot of questions probably about confidentiality. I'll address those. Certain contract terms you'll want to make sure that you include. And then we'll talk also about some tools and technology that are available. Again, just a way to marshal the resources that you're using on humans. Is there a component of that you can outsource to technology? So forensic accounting, for those who don't know, is not the typical financial statement audits and tax returns that you probably think of your local CPA as doing. We are really responsible for crime investigations. And as that relates to what we do on the E-MDTs, I'll talk about, but broadly speaking, when you are looking for a forensic accountant in your area, it's not like you're going to go down to your normal tax preparer's office and say, hey, can you take a peek at this case? That's probably not their area of expertise. Forensic relates to evidence. It's used in a court of law. So, narrowly speaking, we provide numbers-based evidence for a variety of different cases. But broadly, we work in the area called non-traditional services. Again, that's everything that's not financial statement audits or tax returns. So that might be supporting various types of litigation. One case that I worked on early on in my career was actually an arson case, and we had to prove that this guy who burned his building down didn't have a financial motive to do so. So anything weird like that, a forensic accountant will get involved in. We'll do some expert witness testimony. We can place valuation on businesses if that's something that there's a dispute about. Certainly, we get involved in divorces, bankruptcies, fraud investigation I talked about, sometimes internal auditing. That's something that a traditional auditor or traditional accountant won't do. So this list on the side of the screen is really, if you're looking at a CPA's website and any of those keywords jump out at you, that generally indicates that the CPA that you're looking at dabbles in non-traditional services and might be a fit for working with you on your team. So important to remember, there are two distinctions with forensic accountants, and we learned this in New York State. Forensic accountants can reside in the public sector. That might be law enforcement based, DA's office based. And what we found, particularly in New York City, when we started our E-MDTs there, we had some forensic accountants from the DA's office. And that was really great because they had all of this information about the status of the investigation. However, they weren't able to share it based on grand jury confidentiality. And what we found as our teams grew and our caseloads increased, that much of the time, our cases don't wind up in criminal prosecution. Because to get there, you need to compile financial evidence. And if it's not an active criminal matter yet, how do these law enforcement-based forensic accountants get involved? Because they can't. So that's when we decided to pull in community-based forensic accountants. And that's somebody like me, my practice, any CPA firm that might exist in your community. And it's really important to involve a community-based forensic accountant, even if you do have a law enforcement based one as well, because we can get involved in civil matters, right? Anything that's not criminal, but we can also get involved in the criminal investigations. There are only a couple of DA's offices in the state of New York who have the funding to be able to have forensic accountants on staff. For every other agency, they need to outsource it. So that's what a private or community-based forensic accountant can do. And that distinction is important, having both, or at least the community-based forensic accountant, because we need to gather enough evidence to get to the level of criminal prosecution, right? Or at least to get law enforcement or the DA's office interested. And sometimes when it doesn't go to prosecution, we may need it to support a guardianship petition. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. And most importantly, I think, is helping the victim understand what really happened if they're in a position to, understand what happened and continue to make decisions about their care. Having a forensic accountant's report, interpreting those financial records helps that individual decide, am I going to revoke this POA? Am I going to evict this nephew that's living with me? Because the financial information is presented by the forensic accountant in this really clear and concise way. So those are just a couple considerations as you go out and locate your forensic accountants. To check if someone is or has an active CPA license, if you are working with a forensic accountant and the goal is ultimately to have them testify on some of your cases, you'll want to make sure that they're a CPA. That's important because, and not in all cases, there's some CFEs, which I'll talk about in a minute, can testify as well. But a CPA is really a universally recognized designation. You can put that person in front of a jury. The jury has a general idea that a CPA knows numbers and is trustworthy. It doesn't take a lot of extra explanation like any of the additional certifications that may exist have. So CPAverify.org, not all jurisdictions, CPA licenses are managed by each state. Not all of the states report to CPAverify.org, but that's a quick way to see, is somebody duly licensed. Another place that you can check, every state has a state society of CPAs. They may publish the list online, or there may be a number that you can call to locate, who are CPAs that practice in the forensic or non-traditional service area. The AICPA, that is our national and now international membership society. We maintain a list, find a CPA. Again, not all CPAs register on this list. It's kind of a self-directed thing. You might be able to locate that there. Also, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. It's very common for a forensic accountant to have the CFE designation. These individuals are trained in fraud investigation. They do a lot of expert testimony, so they can help out as well. It just takes a little extra explaining on the stand, what a CFE does and all of that. Certainly not insurmountable. Either of those individuals, or preferably someone who has both, is a great person to bring on board with your teams. If you are thinking about alternative ways to use your funds, maybe that's not going directly to an expensive firm, there are a lot of retired investigators out there, law enforcement, men and women who have established their own perhaps private investigation practice or forensic accounting practices after they've retired. So if you're aware of any in your community, they might be someone who you could pull in to your teams, and possibly for lower rates as well. Student internship programs are an option as well. I will tell you, that's actually how I got started in this space. Lifespan of Greater Rochester, many of you are familiar with. They helped to start the E-MDT program in New York State. And I was an intern in college early on that had worked with them. I was going for my graduate degree in forensic accounting. They reached out and said, our caseworkers are getting all of these requests for financial exploitation cases, and we really don't know what to do with them. So can one of your students comb through the financial records and just try to make sense of them? And based on that work, when it came time to build the E-MDTs in New York, I was a natural fit, and here we are. So consider some student internship programs with your local universities. Do they have an accounting program? Do they have a specific forensic accounting track? And what my institution did way back when was just come to an agreement with Lifespan that said, our students will go through the records, for a reasonable wage. But under no circumstances can they testify, right? And we wouldn't have been admitted to testify based on lack of experience anyway, but we just had to iron out that little bit before the students could work. So that's just something to consider. What a forensic accountant can do on the E-MDTs, there are really 5 touch points. The first is we can attend meetings, and it all depends on the amount of resources you have, whether the forensic accountant is going to charge for attendance at those meetings or they're not. But the role of that individual there is to listen to the cases that are brought to the table and provide their perspective. Sometimes that perspective is just explaining different financial transactions or financial terms, types of assets or debt accounts to the team who may not have that in-depth financial knowledge or background. We provide a lot of training, kind of like this. What is our role on a team, and what does an investigation look like? What are some of the steps that we take as forensic accountants that you as first responders like APS and law enforcement can take when you are conducting an investigation? So we do a lot of training. We do case consults. I'll talk about case analysis first. That's probably where my practice spends a lot of our time, is when a law enforcement officer or APS worker receives a whole bunch of documents for a case, they'll turn those over to the forensic accountant, and we'll go through those records soup to nuts and produce a report that says, here is how much was spent, here's how much of that spending went to the benefit of the victim, the suspect, etc. That's full-blown case analysis. On the other side of that, we also do case consults. So if one of your workers or anybody on the team is in the field or sitting with a client or even back at their desks, and you just have a quick question about the direction to take your case, or you're looking at a document and you don't really know what you're reading, you can shoot that over to us and we'll take a look at it. So that's what a forensic accountant would do for a case consult. Just a quick question, phone call or email, and it's done. Versus, of course, a case analysis where we're reviewing all of these records and putting together a formal report. Depending on how that report is used, we may wind up doing some court testimony. It's rare. I want to say that we're only in court a handful of times a year, and we look at hundreds of these cases. They really, if the work is done right, you really don't ever get there, because it's hard to argue with the numbers. They either did or they didn't. So just make sure when you are talking to forensic accountants that they are willing to provide testimony, and that they're willing to provide testimony in civil as well as criminal matters, and that they're familiar with the process around those. So that is what forensic accountants will do on E-MDTs. How do you determine when to involve a forensic accountant? There was a lot of trial and error, I think, in New York when we first started doing this, but we came up with these 5 categories of when it's important for a forensic accountant to get involved. And that first one is supporting APS investigations. Most of the referrals in New York to the teams come from Adult Protective Services, and I imagine it's going to be very similar in your districts as well. As much as we support APS, we also support law enforcement. Some referrals come directly there as well. Criminal prosecution, when you need someone to testify, when you need a report or exhibits put together that clearly explain what happened with the money, that's when a forensic accountant should be involved, because that's really our role, is breaking down the language barrier between the numbers people and the non-numbers people, and just explaining it in plain English. Certainly, that same principle applies to guardianships. If you want to enhance your guardianship petition, have a forensic accountant produce a report that shows the spending. In addition to showing the spending in the account, what's important in a guardianship petition or conservatorship, depending on what your state calls it, it's important for the forensic accountant to make an opinion that, based on the spending that they have seen over the past X number of years, if this pattern continues, the individual, the alleged incapacitated person, is at serious risk of harm. So in a criminal prosecution, we're acting as a fact witness, and we're just saying, here's what happened. In a guardianship, we may be asked to be an expert witness and give that professional opinion. So that's how those two differ. And then the other one I talked about earlier is just informing the victim and or the family what happened, how it happened, and help them make decisions about how to move forward. What are the protections we can put in place so that it doesn't happen again? Or what decisions do we have to make right now to ensure that it doesn't happen? So those are 5 things to consider when to get a forensic accountant involved in your case. So when we do a full-blown case review, we'll call it case analysis, the agency that first received the case generally makes a referral to the E-MDT coordinator. So the agency is responsible for documenting the facts of the case and then contacting the coordinator to say, I think I need a forensic accountant. That coordinator has their own intake, right? Because we need all of the specific reporting that goes to the National Center, of course, and then to our grant funders. So the coordinator is the gatekeeper. They decide, yes, I know you think that you need a forensic accountant for this. We agree. We're going to make the referral to the forensic accountant. And sometimes they say, this doesn't really seem like a complex case, or it doesn't match our particular qualification criteria. You don't have access to it. The coordinator is the one that marshals the funds, right? And then ultimately makes the connection from the agent between the agency and the forensic accountant. Generally, you do not make direct referrals to the forensic accountant. It's set up differently in some places. There were some locations in New York where I could get a referral directly from APS or law enforcement. And we would just CC in the coordinator so that they were aware. In other places, it's the coordinator first as the gatekeeper and then to us. And then what we do on our end is we'll have a call with the referring agency. We will review the intake form that came from the coordinator. And we'll ask, what is this individual, what is the agency's goal for this case? Is it just supporting their initial investigation, like we talked about? Is it ultimately criminal prosecution? Are we there yet? Is guardianship on the radar? Knowing this at the onset really helps how we develop our report and the things that we look at when we go through. Certainly, we will give you a list of records that you need to obtain. Review those records when they come in, and then ultimately produce a deliverable in written form. And that written form I will talk about shortly. It can be just a numerical schedule. It can be a full written narrative, whatever you guys want. The forensic accountant should hopefully be able to deliver in a format that's easy to read and understand by everybody at the table. The referral process is very similar on the case consult side. Same deal, document the facts of the case, contact the coordinator. The coordinator, the gatekeeper, of course, performs whatever intake procedures they need to, and then connects the agency with the forensic accountant. Again, we will have a call with you, hear the facts of the case, and then take a peek at whatever document you might want us to look at. We'll provide advice about direction, what documents to get at that point, whatever individual question you have based on that case, we'll do in a case consult. So, the point being here, whether it's a consult or whether it is a case analysis, even if it's a request for training, those requests go through the coordinator, and the coordinator will put you in touch with the forensic accountant. So if you are in the coordinator role, it's really important as you move forward to reinforce that role and that responsibility when you communicate with the other agencies at the table. You are in charge. So some characteristics as we worked through, we have generally gotten involved in cases when there is some sort of urgent deadline, right? You've got this pile of boxes. There's no way your existing team can go through these cases, or these documents in time for a court deadline. You would send those to the forensic accountant. You would indicate what day you needed that by, and then hopefully they would be able to turn that deliverable around within that time frame. If there is a complex account structure, right, there's a lot of brokerage accounts, there's money moving back and forth in checking and savings accounts, maybe that there's a lot of debt, there's a reverse mortgage. Whenever you have that complex asset and debt structure, you might want to get a forensic accountant involved just to untangle all of that, so you feel confident moving forward with whatever your intervention is. If the duration of abuse was long, or you don't know how long that it's gone on, and we have to get into the records and look at the patterns to figure that out. If there's any kind of commingling and we need to figure out whose spending was whose, we're trained and experienced, and we have, of course, software programs that look for that kind of thing. Any unknown spending habits. If you need to ferret that out, if you've got a client who can't answer questions anymore about what their normal expenses and income are, turn the records over to the forensic accountant. We'll be able to ferret that out based on pattern analysis. If there's multiple perpetrators, right? Again, which spending was which? Guardianship, of course, always recommended to get us involved. Law enforcement involvement. If you just want, it's nice when we put a report together for law enforcement, because sometimes they may not be willing to take a case. But when you put it together in this perfect package with a report that says, here's who stole how much, and the law enforcement officer can easily see which charge could be brought, that may make a huge difference in moving your case forward. And then, of course, like we talked about, client acknowledgement, just getting them to understand, here's the full scope of what happened. What do you want to do next? An example that I use frequently in my trainings, there was a woman in New York, and she had a niece, I believed, that lived with her. And she was telling everybody, APS would inquire, we've got a referral for financial exploitation. It looks like your niece is taking a lot of money. And the woman said, no, I agree. I agree to give her this money. It's really only $100 here and there. Well, we dug into the records, and it ended up being like $30,000 in one single year. So we brought that back to the woman and said, yeah, I know you said it was $100 here and there, but did you know it was a total of $30,000 over a year? And that was enough for the woman to say, that's not what I wanted. And she was able to remove that niece's POA. She wasn't going to press charges, right? She wanted to maintain a relationship with her. But ultimately, that was really a client-directed response to the situation. And the clear forensic accounting report helped get us all there. So to make a good referral to your forensic accountant, always include a written narrative of the case. It's just something for us to go back to and remember the facts, because certainly if you have a high volume of cases, they all tend to blend into each other sometimes. So having that narrative to go back to at each point in the case is really helpful. At minimum, we should have the victim's name, of course, the perpetrator's name, what their relationship is, what their living situation is. Are they a relative? Are they a friend? How long have they been in a relationship? And then what the primary concern is regarding the financial exploitation. And I say primary concern because there was an instance years ago now where we got boxes and boxes of records in the mail. They were brokerage account statements for tons of accounts over time. And we were going back and forth trying to get a meeting on the calendar with the referral source, and we just couldn't. But in the meantime, we got started analyzing the records and said, well, we'll piece the information together when we're able to connect. Well, anyway, it turns out that even though there were boxes and boxes of records that were sent, they were only really concerned about this one $30,000 check. So, essentially we had gone through all of these boxes of records for naught, when we could have just looked for one particular check. So indicating that in your referral saves everybody a lot of time. What are we really looking for here? If the exploiter or the alleged abuser has power of attorney, if you are able, demanding an accounting from them can be very helpful, so that we compare the accounting that the POA prepared to the one that we'll ultimately prepare. We can then demonstrate that this individual was incapable of putting together an accurate accounting and therefore should not serve in that role. So that can be really helpful. If a power of attorney doesn't exist, or if they can't produce an accounting, no big deal. If you have it, send it over. The big thing too, bank statements and supporting documents. We have a whole detailed list of particular documents that should be requested, but at minimum, we want the statements, the deposit items, the withdrawal slips, and the canceled checks. Credit report, if you can get it, and then any other statements and records you might have gathered in your initial investigation. Turning all of that information over to the forensic accountant is really helpful because it pieces together a story for us. And when we review all of the records, we'll be able to produce a report that summarizes all of them, without flipping, or having you or a judge or whomever flip page to page. So that is a really good referral when you come to us with all of this information. So this is a list of records I was talking about. I think all of you will have access to these slides so you can reference them. It's really important that we get not just the bank statements. I like to think of it as the bank statements are like the skeleton, they're the bones, right? But all of these other pieces of information, like the account opening and change documents, the deposit items, withdrawal slips, the checks, those are the meat. Those paint like the really pretty picture of what has gone on. Deposits items, withdrawal slips, copies of canceled checks, they tend to be more standard documents to include with the bank statements. What are generally not standard and you have to be extra careful about asking for are the account opening and change documents. Not just the form when the account was opened, but change documents will show who else was added to the account while the victim held it. Is a power of attorney added to account at a certain time? Was it changed at a certain time? All of that information the bank has, they just need to turn it over. Also transfer details. So you may look at a bank statement and it may say a $3,000 transfer on a certain date, but it doesn't tell you what account it got transferred to. It certainly doesn't tell you when it's an external financial institution or financial account, right? It's not printed on the statements, but the bank has that information. You just have to ask for it. We want to look at a copy of the power of attorney because we will compare the copy that exists at the bank to, say, the copy that exists at the clerk's office or the copy that the victim or the alleged abuser provided. Any certified checks, we call them bank checks for purposes of this presentation. But, when you buy a car, your bank statement will say, check $25,000 perhaps. It won't get turned over with the copies of the regular checks. You have to ask specifically for copies of any certified or bank checks. We think about financial exploitation in terms of depository accounts, right? Like checking and savings. We also need to think about the debt side of the equation. Ask the bank if there are any open mortgages or loans or credit cards. And have them include those records in the request as well. And then credit card statements, of course. Most banks won't have those. They use a carrier. So those you might have to get either with the client's consent or through cooperation with law enforcement and subpoena. But at minimum, these are the types of records that the forensic accountant should be looking at. Other helpful documents, we talked about the power of attorney. That's a helpful document because it shows who was appointed as agent, what specific powers were they allowed to have, and on what particular date. Healthcare proxy, who makes healthcare decision? Is it the same person who is the power of attorney? Is it the same person who's the beneficiary? Might that person be making decisions that are adverse to the client's longevity because it means that they're getting a payout sooner? That's a consideration, right? Wills, have they been changed recently? We'd want to take a look at that. Real estate records that exist at the county clerk's office. Any life insurance policies, we want to know who the beneficiaries are. When were those policies created? Who's paying the premium? This is not an exhaustive list of other documents you might want to request, and they're certainly not required in every single investigation. But if you happen to come across them, they're helpful to include because every now and then one of these things contains this super helpful nugget that may make or break a case. In New York State, and it varies elsewhere, I'm just using this as an example, Adult Protective Services and our general obligations law allows for adult protective services and law enforcement to request an accounting from the agent. And the agent at that point receiving this demand has 15 days to return an accounting of their spending. If they don't, our APS can bring a special proceeding to revoke that individual. So that's a way that we have used in Betsy's county where she's from. They use this a lot to stop the bleeding. because of course the agent, they were not keeping an accurate accounting. They can't pull it together in 15 days. And so it can be revoked. It was also helpful for us to get that information to be able to say, this individual is clearly not capable of managing funds. They can't even keep an accurate accounting, her balance of checkbook. And that's compelling enough for, say, a guardianship court to make a decision to remove that agent. So something to keep in mind. I don't know if laws exist in your particular areas, but it's worth asking. So anytime that you are working on a case, whether you're using a forensic accountant or not, it's important to establish a timeline of spending. I have a neighbor that's hammering, so if you can hear that, I'm sorry. We want to know in a timeline, and this is important as you structure your investigation, when were dates that the power of attorney was signed? When did a suspect get involved? Is there some kind of capacity determination that happened along the way? So that when we summarize the bank records or the financial activity that took place, we kind of overlay that timeline and look at what happened when, what were the patterns before an individual got involved versus after, and what can we infer from there? And then write a narrative that documents those facts and findings. That's the approach generally that we take for our cases. Whether or not you use a forensic accountant, you can take that approach when you're conducting your own investigation or when the individuals on your team are. So some case examples that have come to the teams over time, these are, really simple, but general larceny, right? There was a man who lived in a condo or apartment complex, and he befriended the local handyman, and that handyman eventually would run errands for him. And he would take his debit card. Well, as time went on, he took the debit card and he started swiping it at ATM machines. And this occurred while the individual was hospitalized. So when we got the referral that financial exploitation was possibly happening, of course, we're seeing all these transactions that took place while we knew the victim was in the hospital. And then we were able to point those out to the prosecution. The handyman was indicted, he pled guilty. And ultimately restitution was ordered. So, that is a pretty cut and dry case, right? But that's an example of using a forensic accounting in a criminal proceeding. On the guardianship side, there was a woman who was hauled into court by her sister because the sister wanted out of, or the sister held a mortgage on the woman's half of the house, but the victim was unable to continue to pay that mortgage. And so the sister, unfortunately, was foreclosing on the other sister, on the victim. There was a guy standing outside of the courthouse, basically waiting for these people who would come out, elderly people, distraught because they were going to lose their homes, and say, you know what, I have an option for you. And what he did with this woman was take her through the reverse mortgage process. And as soon as the reverse mortgage proceeds hit her account, he walked off with them. He had set up a joint account, moved the money to an account that was only in his name. And then we were unable to trace it after that, unfortunately. However, because the E-MDT got involved, we were able to file an Article 81 and demonstrate what had happened and why this woman needed additional protection going forward. And then finally, mismanagement. Not all cases brought to the team that look like financial exploitation will be. Often they are, but every now and then it's just a simple case of someone not knowing what to do with their money, and no malice behind it. So we had a woman who, she had 2 trailers. One belonged to her, one belonged to her late husband, but it was of such sentimental value to her that she didn't want to give her husband's trailer up. So enter this nephew. He starts living in the trailer and operating this car repair service out of it. And I believe the neighbors called APS and they were like, hey, this, some guy just moved in. We don't think he's paying. And APS went out, investigated, found that he was depositing the proceeds from his auto repair shop into a joint account that he held with this woman. And if he hadn't done that, she wouldn't have been able to continue to afford those 2 trailers. So the decision was made at the team, well, obviously this isn't financial exploitation. He's actually helping her. He just needs to do it appropriately. He had become the POA. And so we just said, you can't commingle funds under a power of attorney relationship. How about you keep this account for that trailer and she keeps this account for her trailer, and everybody's happy. So that's something you might see. Always keep that in mind, even if it looks like financial exploitation, sometimes it's not. And the team can still come up with a creative solution so that the victim is happy and healthy and stays in her home. So some lessons that we learned along the way, I want to share with you. We talked about the role of community-based and law enforcement-based forensic accountants. Knowing that difference early on is going to save you a lot of frustration around what information you can and can't share, and where these forensic accountants can work and where they can't. It's really important to make contact with fraud investigators at your local and major banks. A lot of APS agencies have trouble getting bank records without law enforcement involvement. And in a lot of these cases, law enforcement isn't involved yet. So making those important contacts, and this could be something that the coordinator takes on, just so that they know what the E-MDT does in the community, and they know that they have the power to turn over those records without fear of fine. So that's something to consider. OCR text recognition software, back in the day, when I first started doing this, we were hand entering these transactions one by one into massive spreadsheets. You don't have to do that anymore. There's OCR technology for reading bank statements. And we've gotten creative over the years, depending on the amount of funding that's been available. Sometimes the coordinators will do some of the preliminary data entry using a software program like this or not, and then turn that over to the forensic accountant, so that you're not spending forensic accounting dollars on simple data entry. So that's something to think about. Ask for everything. Those detailed requests and subpoenas, when you send them to the bank, they might be a blanket APS or law enforcement subpoena. Add those additional documents. Be specific about requesting those items we talked about. Everything should be labeled attorney work product or labeled draft until they're done. This, especially when you're working with prosecution, and that is because the attorney's privilege will extend to those documents. And then the other thing, when you are cooperating with your DA's offices, it's important to understand where they stand on the issue of sharing orders. Some district attorneys or ADAs, they believe that a subpoena should specifically state that the records will be shared with a third party. It's called a rider or a sharing order. Other district attorneys say we don't need to include that. Make sure before you send out your subpoenas for records that you know your forensic accountant is going to look at. Make sure you have your subpoenas have that language if your DA subscribes to that school of thought. And the reason is we had this problem in New York. We did a very big case, and our names were not on the sharing order. There was no sharing order. The DA got a hold of the case even after the report was done and said, absolutely not, we're throwing this case out because, you know, Weber CPA was not on the sharing order. So really important to have a discussion with your DA. Does he or she believe in the sharing orders or not, before you make a big expensive mistake like that. So those are some war stories or lessons from the road that hopefully help you have a smooth practice. Deliverables, you will get these slides, but you know, there's a whole host of things that we can provide as forensic accountants. Sometimes you just need individual exhibits, or we call them schedules or reconciliations, right? Showing the money that was in the account, everything that came in and from where, everything that went out and to where, and the ending balance. And it's enough to put that up, right, and point to the different activities. If that's all you need, and you can run with that, that's great. That's all the forensic accountant has to provide to you. Sometimes you want a little bit more. We'll put memos together that are those financial schedules, but then it'll have a memo on top that says, here are the things we found that you should pay particular note or pay particular attention to. Or there's a full-blown report, and a full-blown report is something that you need if you're going to ultimately go to court. And that report needs to be structured in an expert witness format. The AICPA, prescribes what that format is. So those are just 3 levels of deliverable that your forensic accountant can provide, and they can provide that to you based on whatever the needs of your case are. Don't have them go and do a full-blown report when all you need is to look at the ins and outs in the account and make your own decisions, right? Just another way to marshal those assets. Preliminary schedules should look something like this. It should show the beginning balance, what came in from where, what went out and to where, and how the balance changed over time. So some people might be able to look at this on their own and say, oh, okay, I can pick out different activities. For our purposes here, you look at this and you realize, all right, this individual makes about $23,000 a year in Social Security. She gets what looks like the required minimum distribution from her IRA each year. But then in the year 2015, there was a $16,000 deposit and we don't know where it came from. So that's an investigative lead, right? That's something you want to go back to the bank and say, hey, get me the deposit item for this $16,000. I want to know, is that another investment account we're not aware of? Is it another checking account we're not aware of? Is this life insurance proceeds? What is it? What was going on in the victim's life? And is it related to the alleged exploitation? On the other side, down in the spending, we want to look at all of the withdrawals. And now our schedules will be really long, right? You'll have detailed payee information under each of these categories. But if we were to look at this schedule and say, okay, in 2013, our alleged abuser was not involved. And this woman paid all of her bills, most of her bills by check, total of $59,000 for the year. It also appears that she used an American Express credit card. Now, jump ahead to 2014. This is the year our alleged abuser got involved, and check spending jumped to $108,000. Could be legit. Maybe she had some additional home care expenses that year. Her level of care went up, or maybe the financial exploitation started, right? We would have a detailed list of exactly what was spent where in the check category. We look at American Express, well, it was $25,000 in that year. It's lower this year. It's $29,000 in 2015. Maybe I'm not so concerned. But in 2016, in this particular case, we only looked at the first 3 months, the first quarter of the year. And already the spending on the card in those first 3 months was the amount of her annual spending in that base year of 2013. So automatically we know, what, maybe we weren't going to request the Amex statements because we don't think that person got a hold of them. Based on the spending in 2016, maybe we got to go request them. So it's just being able to read the schedules like this and say, all right, this is what we're seeing. What is it? What should we do next? That is the purpose of getting a forensic accountant involved. Some written narratives, like I said, the memo is just an abbreviated narrative, right? What are the accounts that we looked at? What are the important background facts and assumptions that we used to come to the findings that we include in the memo? And then, of course, attaching those supporting schedules to it. Whereas a full-blown report, right, is prepared in accord with professional standards so that when we get to court, it's accepted on the stand and we can testify to it. Important thing, especially with the report, if you're using it for prosecution, make sure that it's marked draft until the attorney approves it. So the report may have some other summary schedules. We like to show this particular one, which shows all the withdrawals in the account, where it was spent, how much was attributed to the client, how much was attributed to the suspect, and then there's always this chunk of money that's unaccounted for. And what that means is that we don't have enough evidence to determine whether it was the client or the suspect. We may go further and put these detailed charts together of the funds that were attributed to the suspect, right? So of that $626,000, that was a check payable to the suspect, checks to cash that were endorsed by the suspect, anything that we were able to demonstrate the suspect was the beneficiary or last holder of that cash. And these charts are really helpful for prosecution because each of these different ways of taking money often carry a separate charge. So law enforcement is interested in this schedule because they say, okay, this is the larceny, this is the petty larceny, this is felony, this is misdemeanor, those kinds of things. This detailed chart can help them get there. We might throw some other illustrative exhibits in there based on the data. whether we create those in Excel ourselves based on what we see, or whether we take them directly from the documents that we review. You know, if there's something particularly compelling like this credit score history, we know in July of 2016 that the suspected perpetrator got involved and this poor woman's credit score tanked right after. That's pretty compelling evidence that we want to make sure to include. So some uses, of course, we talked about guardianship, prosecution. We have used our report in family court, various civil matters. Sometimes the tax office gets involved, whether it's state taxes or the IRS, because an individual took all this money from the victim, but they probably didn't report it as income like they ought to. And maybe you can't get law enforcement involved, but the tax office is another way to do that. Same thing on public benefits side. If your perpetrator is a recipient of public benefits, the welfare office may be interested because certainly they did not report that income that they stole, and they should have. So some key things, we'll switch to the admin side. I know we've got just about 10 minutes left. Confidentiality, how we've addressed it in New York is everybody signs a confidentiality agreement on an individual basis. So it's not just me signing on behalf of my whole agency. Each one of my employees has to sign one. Each member of APS that shows up at the meeting has to sign one. The coordinator keeps all of these. So you should know that forensic accountants, if they are licensed, say a CPA or a CFE, they are bound by their professional standards and a code of conduct that prohibits disclosure of financial information. So above and beyond the confidentiality agreement that exists, we have professional standards that we need to abide by. Government agencies, of course, on their own, they have their own policies and regulations governing the sharing of records. I talked about those sharing orders. Discuss these with the DA's office before you're engaging your FA, right? FA meaning forensic accountant, just so we know, are we going to be able to share grand jury records with you? And what are the steps we need to take to be able to do that? So contract-wise, if you are a forensic accountant, again, and you are duly licensed and certified, our professional standards govern what can and can't be in our engagement letters, right? So when you are working with a forensic accountant, I can share with you the engagement letter that we use as a template. Every state might be a little bit different. Make sure that your engagement letter says consulting engagement. There's a separate one for testimony. Make sure that your forensic accountant references the applicable professional standards that they operate under, that they're defining their scope of services, right? So they know what they're doing when they come to your table and you know what to expect from them. And it really shouldn't vary or go outside that scope. The engagement letter should detail what rates they're charging and what level. You're not going to, you know, that the partner of the firm is probably going to charge a higher rate than, say, a staff person. You should expect to pay hourly rates for services. A lot of us in the CPA world have talked about like value-based pricing, but it's really hard to assign a fixed fee to each case because you don't know how many accounts, you don't know how many years. If you at the coordinator level are involved in a government agency or a nonprofit agency that has your own standard contracts, what you can do is have the forensic accountants submit their engagement letter anyway, and just attach that to your standard organizational contract document. So that way the forensic accountant is happy because their terms are covered and included, and you guys are happy because your standard contract is being used. So things to keep in mind on the contract side. I'll talk through quickly some tools and technology that exists. Again, any opportunity that you have to reduce the workload of the forensic accountants, if the funding amount is small, some tools. There's a Feist. We created that in New York State for APS workers. It's 5 steps. They're in Word documents. There's one Excel document that basically walks you through a financial exploitation investigation. There are some supporting records in there or documents that help you organize your case. They're not required. If you're interested in a copy of the Feist, I can get that to you. It's open source, public access, no charge for it. We worked with the Department of Justice to create a SAFTA tool, and it's available at the link here. There is an Excel-based tool that does some data analysis. It does require manual entry, but once you make that manual entry, it pre-populates some charts and graphs automatically that you can print as exhibits for use in court. Also, the SAFTA guide that goes along with it has a detailed questionnaire of information you should collect, things that you should be looking for, all to help the people around the table at your E-MDT investigate their cases. So the SAFTA is available there at the IACP website. On the intervention side, if you have somebody in your office who is particularly strong on the finance side, there are some statement reading softwares that you can use to handle some of the data entry and analysis in-house before you give it to a forensic accountant. Acrolis has a program called Perfect Audit. You can go to acrolis.com. We actually use them in Weber CPA's practice. ScanWriter, of course, many of you may be aware of, and BankScan. Those are just a few statement reading softwares if you want to handle data entry on the OCR side. I actually created over the last 3 years now a software called fraudfinder.com, and we created it based on the work that we do at Weber CPA. APS simply uploads the PDF records to a CSV file of the data to the software. It runs its own analysis and populates a report. So that's something you might want to take a look at. Fraudfinder.com is the site there. On the prevention side, if after the investigation is done, you want to protect the client going forward, some account monitoring tools for their new agent or guardian or family, EverSafe, BillGuard, and Mint have these features. And then on the bill payment side, silverbills.com automates bill payment for seniors, as well as Everyday Money Management, this Plum Bill Pay, and also an app called Care is there. So just some things for you to look into technology-wise. Recapping, stewarding your FA dollars is really important because you've got a limited amount and you've got an increasing workload. Consider alternative talent, right? It doesn't have to be a full-fledged forensic accountant every single time. Consider your interns, consider practitioners outside your geographic area. Weber CPA is available for hire. We do all our work remotely. We'd be happy to work with your team. And if you have really strong staff internally who like this finance stuff, definitely train them on tools like the Feist and SAFTA or Fraud Finder or something like that. And maybe they're able to take a bulk of the work so that you're reserving forensic accounting dollars for maybe more high level value added work, like looking at more complex transactions, real estate, that kind of thing. Make sure you have a good handle on what your referral process is and streamline it. You need a really strong coordinator who can gatekeep, like we talked about, and not be afraid to say, no, you don't have access to the forensic accountant for this particular case, and these are the reasons why. Communicate whatever your referral policies or requirements are to your team so nobody's surprised. So everybody knows here are the case characteristics that would merit, a forensic accountant involvement. And have clear and specific procedures for how that information, how that referral comes in, what documentation is supposed to come over so that there isn't a lot of back and forth between the coordinator and the forensic accountant, just to have specific procedures for what needs to come over right off the bat so that the forensic accountant can be efficient about their work. And, the other thing is leveraging technology. If you've got a strong financial person in-house that can do some data entry, we have used that approach before. Certainly, there is technology that we talked about that you could do in-house and just use the forensic accountant for the complex stuff. So those are the tips that I have for really making the best use of your forensic accounting dollars. My role here at the center is to answer any of your questions. So I'm available by email. Those TA requests will go through the National Center, just like they're the gatekeepers, right? Send your requests to the National Center. Of course, if you want to learn more about Weber CPA's services or you want to talk about fraudfinder.com, reach out to me here and I'll do that for you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen And I'm just going to go through, we've got 2 minutes left. You guys are introducing yourself. Feist, yes, absolutely. I will send that over to your TA providers and they can get that out. The slides will be available. And again, I'm here. No question is too silly. I've been doing this with the E-MDTs for 10 years. And so we've seen it all. So don't be afraid to ask.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a great presentation and very helpful, explaining some kind of more complex issues that we're facing as E-MDT teams. So I just dropped a evaluation link in the chat. So we would love your feedback. It helps us kind of prepare for future webinars as well as see what we're doing well, see what we can work on. So that's in the chat now. We will also get that those resources to you. I know folks in the chat would like to access those. So if there's any questions, we do have 1 minute left of Karen's time. So please feel free if you do have questions. And everyone remember to vote today. I hope you have a good rest of your Tuesday.
Karen, I have a question in terms of processes. I feel like sometimes, like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I feel like sometimes the detectives are a little less driven to explore something if they don't see the evidence of what's going on. So do you look at the forensic accounting prior to getting law enforcement to filing those probable cause statements, or is it usually after?
No, it's usually before, and it's really to support the referring agency to say, what are we dealing with here? Is it financial exploitation? And can we put together enough information to take the next step, which might be law enforcement involvement?
So who initiates that if it's not law enforcement? Is it typically APS?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sometimes there are nonprofit service providers who have caseworkers. The case might come through them. Anybody who has access to that particular client through their program. We don't, in New York, we don't take referrals directly from the community, right? They all have to come through the agency.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So again, thank you so much, Karen, for your time today. And thanks for everyone who attended. And the session will be recorded if you hopped on before or after it started.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Karen. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talk soon.